The exodus of migrant workers during the lockdown of 2020 was an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, and now it has been dwarfed by a full-blown political battle. I'm Barkha Dutt, and you're watching the Mojo Story. Let's bring you the key developments of what has now become, as I said, a political story. The Prime Minister has targeted in Parliament both the Congress and other opposition parties for what he has called a COVID Paap. He has accused these parties of instigating workers to leave the cities and walk home for their villages on foot. Now remember, these are unforgettable images, and the Mojo Story was on the ground for 3 months walking with these workers as they walked sometimes more than hundreds of kilometers without food or water under the blazing sun with their children to get home. The Prime Minister says the opposition is to blame. The opposition says the government is to blame. And lost in this din, including between Arvind Kejriwal and Yogi Adityanath, are the lives of India's forgotten people, invisibilized then and invisibilized now, perhaps, as its political headlines that seem to take center stage. To look at the Prime Minister's remarks and the opposition's response, let's introduce our guests of the program today. We're joined by Ishkaran Bhandari. He's a political analyst, a lawyer, has often supported the government on key issues. Will he support the Prime Minister on this as well? We'll ask him in a moment from now. Nikhil Day has often been a critic of the government, but he's someone who has spent his life working with workers. He's in fact a founder member of the MKSS, an organization that is committed to the rights of workers and Mazdoors. We're joined by Anjali Bhardwaj. Anjali has done a lot of work for transparency in public life, has been a key part of our rights to information in particular, and is now with the Satark Nagrik Sangathan. Welcome, Anjali. PKD Nambiar, who's a political analyst, commentator, has also often supported this government on key issues. Will this issue be one of them? We'll find out in a moment from now. Sanjay Jha enjoys the peculiarity of being a lapsed and a sacked Congress spokesperson, critical of the Modi government, but also often critical of his own erstwhile, I don't know if I should call it erstwhile, of his own party, since he still describes himself as a Congress supporter. All right, let me start actually by asking you, Anjali, how did you see those comments from the Prime Minister? For those of us who were on the ground in 2020, these images were impossible to ever forget. They were the sign of a nation in trauma. To be fair, much of the world was groping its way through the dark. The lockdown method was one that countries across the world had used. It was not particular to India. But no one, and certainly the government, did not anticipate that we would see this flight, a flight for economic reasons, as well as psychological and social reasons. Today, the Prime Minister says the opposition triggered the first wave of exodus. How do you see these comments?
Well, Barkha, you said that there was no way that the government saw this flight. I find that very problematic. I think in a country where 90% of the workforce is in the unorganized sector, when a lockdown, and of the kind that was imposed by the national government, is imposed, it is very normal to expect that people will have nowhere to turn. We have people who are working as rickshaw pullers, people who are street vendors, people who work for daily wages. They have no deep pockets or savings. It is impossible to imagine that the government did not know that these people will lose their livelihoods. They will have no way to earn an income, and which will automatically mean that they will not know where to go for food, for how to pay their rent, especially migrant workers and people who don't have their own dwellings, who live on rent. How are they supposed to pay their rent? How will they even afford basic things like milk for their children or medicines in the middle of a pandemic? So I am starting by saying that this is something that could have been easily anticipated and should have been anticipated by any government that was empathetic. Now, on the Prime Minister's remarks, slamming the opposition for this, I think one very important issue that I want to bring up, and without getting involved in any political slugfest, because that doesn't interest me, I want to just point your attention to the RTI applications that were filed to find out whether in our federal structure, where state governments have a very important role to play, where a lot of opposition parties are also in power, how there were consultations and deliberations done to plan for this massive step. And what we learned, and this was also through RTA applications that were filed by the BBC and other people, that more than 240 RTA applications showed that there was no evidence of consultations being held with key stakeholders. The state governments of Uttar Pradesh, Gujarat, the state governments of Delhi, Telangana, Assam, any number of state governments turned around and replied under the RTI that they were not consulted before taking this huge step. Now, if there are no consultations, the opposition parties are not consulted, the state governments are not consulted, and in a move which can best be described as shock and awe, at a 4-hour notice, a country of nearly 4.1 billion people is sent in, 1.4 billion people is sent into a lockdown, the harshest lockdown the world has known. What else would we expect?
Okay. And I think the important point you make is that it wasn't just opposition states that were not consulted, but even BJP governed states, including Uttar Pradesh and Gujarat, you mentioned, that was the result of the RTI applications. That national lockdown, of course, is owned by the central government. The Prime Minister seemed to suggest that the first flood of people leaving, when we saw a mass crowd gathering both at the bus station in Delhi as well as the railway station in Mumbai, he's blaming the opposition for that. Before I get Mr. Bhandari to come in next, I just want our audience to listen in on exactly what the Prime Minister said when he blamed the opposition.
पहली लहर के दौरान देश जब पर्याप्त अवसर दिया था, लॉकडाउन का पालन कर रहा था, जब WHO दुनिया भर के लोगों को सलाह देता था, सारे हेल्थ एक्सपर्ट कह रहे थे कि जो जहां है वहीं पर रुके। सारी दुनिया में यह संदेश दिया जाता था, क्योंकि मनुष्य जहां जाएगा, अगर वो कोरोना से संक्रमित है तो कोरोना साथ ले जाएगा। तब कांग्रेस के लोगों ने क्या किया? मुंबई के रेलवे स्टेशन पर खड़े रह करके मुंबई छोड़कर जाने के लिए प्रोत्साहित करने के लिए मुंबई में श्रमिकों को टिकट दिया गया, मुफ्त में टिकट दिया गया, लोगों को प्रेरित किया गया कि जाओ महाराष्ट्र में हमारे पर जो बोझ है वो जरा कम हो, और जाओ तुम उत्तर प्रदेश के हो, तुम बिहार के हो, जाओ वहां कोरोना फैलाओ। आपने ये बहुत बड़ा पाप किया, अफरा तफरी का माहौल खड़ा कर दिया। आपने हमारे श्रमिक भाइयों बहनों को अनेक परेशानियों में धकेल दिया। और माननीय अध्यक्ष जी, उस समय दिल्ली में ऐसी सरकार थी जो है, उस सरकार ने तो जीप पर माइक बांध करके दिल्ली की झुग्गी झोपड़ी में गाड़ी घुमा करके लोगों को कहा संकट बड़ा है, भागो, गांव जाओ, घर जाओ, और दिल्ली से जाने के लिए बसें दी, आधे रास्ते छोड़ दिया और श्रमिकों को लिए अनेक मुसीबतें पैदा की।
Okay, Ishkaran Bhandari, how do you see those comments? For those of us who remember that moment, I remember when I went to the Delhi border, it was like meeting, orphans of the state. Neither the state government nor the central government had any representation, as in their hundreds, then their thousands, and eventually in the millions, men, women, and children left. There wasn't even a police constable in the first 48 hours. That is what I remember. And there was a certain, passing the buck. All states wanted it to be some other state's problem. So, how do you see the Prime Minister's remark? Isn't it also a case of passing the buck?
Barkha ji, the Prime Minister spoke on a whole lot of issues, out of which we are selecting this issue. He also spoke that there were people who did not even once say that please wear a mask or maintain distance, that would help people. Also, we knew certain politicians who created vaccine hesitancy, and we are still seeing vaccine mandate protests going on in Canada. Not getting into that issue, he referred to it briefly today. So we were in a situation where, anyways, the politics was happening and people were not on board. We were having active senior politicians who are aspiring to big positions, creating vaccine hesitancies or calling it BJP vaccine, etc., etc. We all remember that. Then today, when we talk about it, it is a little easier to talk about it because now, after 2 years, we broadly know what this Mahamari was all about. We still do not know. Those times, if you remember, whether a cotton mask works or does not work, whether lockdowns is the solution, is not the solution. And I, for one, personally, am not in favor of lockdowns, at least the way they are being implemented even today. In this way, if it's a weekend, the virus will not strike you. After 10 p.m., the virus will not strike you. And I have been on public platforms saying that every time you impose lockdown, you put very difficult conditions on the poor people of this country. Then the government servants must also forego their salaries. In the period of lockdown, we will immediately get to know how important the lockdown is or how important the lockdown is not. Let them have their skin in the game and you will get to know. Because every person who's having a rental property or is a migrant or is a worker or is a daily wager suffers an absolute lack of income. So lockdowns, whether they're effective or not, is one topic. Second, what was the opposition doing? Was the opposition on board with the government? Was the opposition not creating vaccine hesitancy? Was the opposition in a position to take care of their state, provide relief to people in slums or migrants, create camps for them? States have a lot of resources. And was the opposition sending people out? That is a complete political debate, which you were on the ground, so you would be better qualified than me to speak on it. But were opposition parties not doing politics? I don't think so. You will make a case for they're not doing politics. They're being on board with whatever the WHO was saying, and everybody in India being united on one track. If India was not united on one track, you can either blame the Prime Minister or you can blame the opposition parties who, he said, thought that this is a great opportunity for them to destroy the Prime Minister's chavi or image and get some political points. So when one side is doing politics, both sides will do politics, and probably in democracy, that's fair enough. So when we come that what happened during the entire COVID period, the first wave, the nation was with the Prime Minister, and in fact, all opinion polls show his ratings went up. It's only the second COVID wave which created problems for him. So by and large, in the first wave, the public at large did agree with him. Rest, what is his political viewpoint, that the opposition created trouble? The opposition will believe it was completely in line with it. It was doing Desh Seva and not creating trouble. But that, I think, is just a political debate.
Okay, I think you make the important point of needing to separate the inevitable politics in election season from the facts strictly of the case. And Sanjay, I think that, while Anjali and Ishkaran have laid out their opening arguments, it is true actually that the non-BJP politicians, for most part, were also missing on the ground. I say this as somebody who was on the ground. They were not present. But of course, the lockdown was a central government decision. There's no two ways about it. And one of the key mistakes, as we now know, is that public transport was shut down. And obviously, the central government also thought it was a mistake because they did not repeat this in the second wave. So there was a lot that was learned. How do you see the Prime Minister's comments, Sanjay?
Barkha, to be very honest, I felt ashamed as a citizen of this country when I heard the Prime Minister brazenly lying in the Lok Sabha. Now, I have been an ideological critic of Mr. Modi's politics. Let's put that aside for the moment. The images that Anjali mentioned earlier, and I'm sure even those who are the cheerleaders of the government cannot pretend to ignore it. I remember one in Maharashtra where there were many migrants who were trying to go home. They slept on the railway tracks in the night, Barkha. They got run over by a goods train. I want to ask our Prime Minister this question. Did you hang your head in shame? We keep talking about leadership of Mr. Modi. Even Donald Trump, whom I'm a big critic of, every life of an American citizen, an American president stands up morally responsible for it. Right or wrong, they fight for it. They even wage a war against a country because of a life of a citizen is involved. Here you had this, in my opinion, a horrific situation where the government has the resources. Why is Mr. Modi the Prime Minister, by the way? He was elected, right, for his governance, foresight, pragmatism. Yes, it was unprecedented. I'll concede that point. Nobody
Those are the
was ready for
images. Those are the images of the of the rail tracks in Aurangabad, where what you mentioned, the mishap happened. We actually went to the village where those men came from. It's a village called Antoli. It's an Adivasi gaon in the heart of Madhya Pradesh in the Shahdol district, and it's an extremely impoverished village of just 60 homes. And I'll never forget the image of that roti, that one roti that these workers were lucky enough to carry with them, and that is what was found on the rail track. So these are the unshakable images for me. I know so many Indians who really feel sickened right now by the politics because we are forgetting once again the lives of the poor. But I'll let you quickly complete your point and then go to PKD Nambiar. Go ahead, sir.
See, Barkha, I need to be, brutally honest on your show because, all of us on this program do speak on multiple public platforms. We have to speak responsibly. I believe the bar for, the whole, kind of a bar for political leadership in India is so low today that, we clap at speeches and whistle at them. Does anybody care for the morality or the content of what is being said? I thought as the prime minister of this country, forget what Mr. Rahul Gandhi calls him or Akhilesh calls him or Mr. Stalin calls him. He's the prime minister, for God's sake. You represent each and every citizen of this country. And you cannot go in parliament and say, I blame the Congress for sending people home. I live in Maharashtra. I live in Mumbai. And I'm telling you something. I know the crisis that happened here in Mumbai that I think Narendra Modi hasn't even heard of. And that is, in my opinion, a shocking disgrace. There were people in panic. I know a guy who makes sandwich not very far away from where my office is who wanted to rush home. What could he do? You think he could go on his mobile and order on Swiggy or on Zomato? He had no food. His daily wages were gone. And Mr. Modi actually should, this time at least, have had the grace to say that the Congress party, and I know the Congress has made many mistakes in the past, but I really applaud Mrs. Gandhi and the Congress for actually getting contributions in and telling all the Pradesh Congress committee people, go out there, give money, send people home. What is wrong with that? And he found faults there. I think it's the ultimate lowest political immorality.
I just want to say on record that apart from the chaos of the first 72 hours, when there was some half-hearted, chaotic attempts to first keep workers behind borders, then send them home, then keep them again behind borders, there was nobody sending anyone home. Not until the trains began. And even when the trains began, and we look at that later in the program, we were told that the state and the central government would share costs. This did not happen. Every single worker I met has borrowed money to take that train ticket home. So please let that be said on record. Neither the state nor the center provided the money for those train tickets. PKD Nambiar, the Prime Minister's comments. What was the need for them? Please attack the Congress all you want. Nobody would care. But this was a humanitarian crisis. It has nothing to do with politics.
Barkha, there is no doubt that it was a kiosk. In the first time when the lockdown happened, as Prime Minister clearly said, it was a universal challenge. It was not just limited to us or to India or for that matter to a US or any other people, everybody. There was definitely a lot of chaos and confusion amongst the governments, amongst the people, amongst the authorities, on all across. So it is not limited to one person or a group of people or a state or a country. It was all across. What the Prime Minister was actually talking about while giving the reply to the motion, the only thing what he said that there are people in the opposition parties, a time when the entire country was required to be standing together, there are some people who used it as a political opportunity or a misadventure or a misunderstanding to malign the Prime Minister and the government rather than standing together in solidarity and as a country. So we have never seen that in opposition leaders in the US or in Canada is raising different voices. We are a large country with a large amount of people who are under poverty. So there is no doubt that we will be able to compare ourselves with other places. But then it is equally important in a crisis situation, everybody comes together and stand together rather than making it as a more of like a political opportunity. And it is something like a very hard fact. You have reported it and many people have reported what happened in Anand Vihar bus adda or in the Mumbai railway stations, the kind of chaos which has created. And there is no doubt it has got an ample proof. It is also a truth what you have shown few minutes ago that a large number of people have died because of whatever reason. But we also need to understand that is the time the political parties should be coming out. You have seen in the first couple of hours, and of course, I agree with Sanjay ji, the later part of the day, almost every parties have been started. Their volunteers were there on the ground and distributing foods and whatever it.
Did you agree with the Prime Minister's statement? I want to ask
you. I think what he said is actually true. See, I live in Delhi. I have an office in Mumbai too. I'm very well aware about what happened at that particular time. This is absolutely a truth. Now that is the time, instead of playing a politics.
Okay. All these so you're saying the opposition played politics.
I'll give you one example. One example in Sangam Bihar. Bihar. I mean, I have the video proof. There was a Delhi government vehicle was roaming around, and the Ram Aadmi Party people were auto rickshaw ke upar jo mic laga ke, they were saying that the people to vacate. And you also know that on Anand Vihar bus adda, from there the people were being evacuated from the buses. And as you said rightly, they were not known to where to go. So there is a lot of misadventure or a confusion which has been created by these two major cities, that is Delhi and Mumbai. And Aam Aadmi Party and the Shiv Sena government or the Maha-Aghadi government needs to take some responsibility of it, rather than putting everything and blaming anything and everything to the Mr. Modi. Also, please note, it is not just limited to that. As Ishkaran was talking about, that there was a vaccine hesitancy is created in India.
I'm not saying the opposition, I'm not saying the opposition is blameless. I, in fact, think the opposition missed its moment during the lockdown. It had a real opportunity to be there among the people, convert that moment, serve them, and also, if they want to be politicians, also gain in their branding, in their narrative, in the story they have to take to the people. But the point is, who takes the bulk of the responsibility? That's where I think this conversation must be. Before I go back to Anjali, and I don't know where Nikhil is. Yes, Ishkaran, go ahead. Ishkaran?
To make a small point here, that it was an unprecedented crisis. Let's say it was like a fire in a closed space. What the Prime Minister is probably trying to say is that people could either calm it down or create a stampede. His point, his political assessment is, by using auto rickshaws in slum areas, etc., people were trying to create a stampede, not calm the fire down. And that was pure politics. That his assessment based on his feedback. And that's for the people to judge.
Okay. Anjali, this point, what Mr. Bhandari has just said, that when there is a fire, you need everybody to stand behind the yellow ribbon, and you need the firefighters to be allowed to do their job. The Prime Minister's accusation is that didn't happen. Maybe there were missteps, but the whole world made missteps. Look at the Americans today. Look at the Americans with their flush of vaccines, unable to even get half of their country vaccinated, which seems almost sort of sacrilegious given, the inequity in the rest of the world. So governments across the world made mistakes. Ours was not the only one. The argument would be it was groping in the dark. What is the most sort of egregious thing you've heard so far that you absolutely do not agree with?
Look, Barkha, a couple of things I want to start by saying, and also responding to some of the points that were made. Let us understand that this was a disaster, but it was nothing of the kind that we can put to saying there was a fire somewhere, there was a tsunami, there were floods. We had about 3 months prior notice. The first few cases of the coronavirus and the point that it might become a worldwide pandemic became quite clear in January.
I just want to interrupt you for a second, because the pictures we're seeing are actually of bodies of workers who died in an accident in UP, and their bodies were put into black plastic bags, placed on ice slabs, and put in the back of a truck. And one of the survivors told me कि हमें बिल्कुल लावारिस कर दिया है. This is what I heard from workers again and again, कि हमें लावारिस छोड़ दिया है. Another man said to me, is it our destiny to die like insects? Are the poor in this country going to die like insects? I just remembered that when I saw those pictures. Sorry, Anjali, complete your point.
No problem. So, Barkha, this was not a natural disaster of the kind where, it suddenly struck the world and India. We knew about it. We saw it coming since January. The lockdown was imposed towards the end of March. There was ample time to plan, to deliberate, to consult, to sit with everybody to make sure that our response was the best that it could possibly have been. Why are we calling this a colossal governance failure, and which induced a humanitarian crisis, is not because it's anybody's case that people knew what had to be done. Maybe at that time it was felt that a lockdown was the best way to go ahead. But how did you do it? How, when the prime minister is saying jo jahan hai wahi par ruke, that is his statement, that's what they wanted. How did they plan for it? When the prime minister came and announced the lockdown, he tried to reassure the people of the country. He said, please don't worry, all the essential commodity shops will remain open. You can go and buy things that you need. Was that any consolation to people who were losing their jobs and their livelihoods? If you don't have income, you don't have any money, how are you supposed to go and pay your rent for the next month? How are you supposed to go and buy rations for your children and medicines and milk for your children and family? So people really were left with no choice. They were not doing it because they wanted to go back home. They were doing it because they realized that in the cities, migrants realized that at least if they made their way back to their villages, they might have some social security, some family to fall back on. And in that situation, the government again abdicated its moral responsibility of transporting people safely back to where they wanted to go.
Which is eventually, by the way, that is what happened. The Shramik trains had to be run. That was a complete chaotic sort of issue as well. The way the trains were rolled out, who paid for them, who eventually took responsibility for the safety of the workers. Many of them died without food and in the heat on board those trains. But Nikhil, in the state versus center battle lines that have been drawn, what worries me is that actually, once again, millions of workers have actually been invisibilized, just as they were in the beginning of the lockdown. You have done a lot of work, in particular in Rajasthan. What would you say when you hear what the Prime Minister says, where he lays the blame squarely at the doors of state governments, in particular the opposition?
Yeah, it was a shocking statement, Barkha. There's no question about it. The Prime Minister's statement, actually, that whole period showed a mirror to the whole country. I think it's not just a question of government. We did not realize, yes, street vendors, we know where they live. We know where people who are on the streets, where they live. But we did not realize that huge 94% of our workforce lives in such a condition of vulnerability. There was an order that the government passed along with the lockdown order saying wages will be paid and people will have to stay where they are. 29th of March, the order was. That order was not followed at all. And that's why people had to leave. They had no food. And those were not just the people on the streets. Those were people, they were our workforce. They were our unorganized sector workforce that was leaving in the millions. And we had not seen them. Our country had not seen them. These were people who are actually behind the entire economy. And they were walking because they had nothing to turn to. And there, the Prime Minister, I would say that the lockdown, I would not question his intent. He wanted to go by this world opinion that everyone should stay wherever they wanted to. How can he question the intent of even the opposition? It's amazing that he would. We did not do enough for those migrant workers. We still do not do enough for them. That is a question that has come before all of us, and it will continue to haunt us until we have a more egalitarian or equitable society, a society with more justice. But the fact that the Prime Minister makes this into a political battle, he mentions specifically 3 states, Barkha. He mentions UP, Uttarakhand, and Punjab. Why? Because there is going to be an election there. So if you look at where the entire discussion is, it is politicizing a scenario. And yes, lockdowns, we should have learned from that. We need to look in also. When he says that you went and you paid free tickets, actually, no one was paying free tickets. A few were paid, very few. And then the Supreme Court's order, I'd just like to read. This is the Prime Minister questioning the Supreme Court order, which said that we, by our order, as directed to the central government and all states and union territories, that all states and union territories shall take all necessary steps regarding identification of stranded migrant workers in their state who are willing to return to their native place and take steps for their return by train, bus, whichever process that will be completed within 15 days. So what was the Supreme Court saying? Just recognizing. It was that same first wave period. The first
Yeah.
wave carried on for a long time. So, and they were stranded. The
There was
workers
a
were
there was
stranded.
a there was actually quite a panicky flip flop on the issue of sending workers home or not. Initially, it was jahan hai wahi rahiye. Then, when workers started walking, there was a sense ki chaliye bhej dete hain, buses organize kar dete hain, and then there was chaos, and governments panicked when there was a throng of people at the bus terminals and the railway stations in Delhi and Mumbai. Now, I know, Mr. Nambiar, you have your hand up. Just a second on Nikhil's point. जब ट्रेन शुरू हुई तो कैसे ये लोग गए वापस? बोला जा रहा है कि इनको टिकट्स खरीद के दी. Of course, the Prime Minister is talking about the first 72 hours. I'm talking about later when the migrant train started. We were told that the states and the center were sharing the cost of sending the workers home. Just a little snippet. I managed to get on board one train, one of the first trains to leave from Karnataka in Gulbarga, and each worker had actually taken debt to buy their tickets home. Listen.
अच्छा, मुझे आप लोगों से एक बात पूछनी है. मैं देख रही हूँ आपके हाथ में ये टिकट है. ज़रा मेरे को अपना टिकट दिखाइए. इस टिकट पे लिखा हुआ है 770 rupees. I just want to clarify to all our viewers, there's been a lot of debate over who pays for these tickets, and we have done a lot of research on this, and officials have told us on record that as far as the railways is concerned, this ticket must be paid for. Now, anyone can pay for it, the worker themselves, a local politician, an NGO, an employer, or the state, but the ticket does have to be bought. तो अब मैं इनसे पूछती हूँ कि इनके टिकट, जो यहाँ सब लोग बैठे हैं, इनके टिकट के पैसे किसने दिए? अब आप मुझे बताइए, किसने दिए इस टिकट के पैसे?
हमने दिया.
आपने खुद दिए?
जी.
तो आपको किसी ने मदद दी है 770 रुपए देने की?
कोई नहीं.
आपने खुद की जेब से दिए?
खुद की जेब से दिए.
यहाँ पे मैं बाकी लोगों से पूछती हूँ, आप में से किस किस ने अपनी टिकट खुद खरीदी? जरा हाथ उठाएं. सबने. यहाँ पे जिस लोगों ने अपनी टिकट के पैसे स्वयं दिए, वो जरा अपने हाथ उठाएं और हाथ उठा के रखें. इस तरफ भी अगर आप देखेंगे तो हाथ उठे हुए हैं. So when we are told repeatedly that workers are not paying for their own tickets, that is absolutely untrue. The lucky ones do have their MLAs. We met people like that also on this train, जिन्होंने हमारे को बोला कि हमारे MLA ने पैसे दे दिए. कई और हैं जिन्होंने बोला कि भाई NGO ने दे दिए. कई और हैं जिन्होंने बोला कि सेठ ने दे दिए. लेकिन यहाँ जो सब लोग हैं, उन्होंने खुद पैसे दिए. मैं सर वहाँ आ जाऊँ. सर, आप बताइए, ये जो टिकट है, आप दिखाएंगे अपनी टिकट? ज़रा हमारे को कैमरा को ऐसे पकड़ के दिखाइए. तो इस पे लिखा है 770 रुपया घर जाने की कीमत. मुश्किल हुई थी टिकट के पैसे देने?
मुश्किल तो हुई है भाई.
बताइए
जी, काम बंद हो चुका था, इसलिए मुश्किल तो बहुत हुई.
अच्छा, कईयों के साथ उनके MLA ने दे दिया, सेठ ने दे दिया, NGO ने दे दिया, प्रदेश की सरकार ने दे दिया. आपके साथ ऐसा
भाई
नहीं हुआ?
ऐसा कुछ नहीं हुआ.
नहीं हुआ. आपको ये बुरा लगता है कि इस समय आप लोगों को इतनी गरीबी के बाद, इतनी परेशानी के बाद टिकट के पैसे भी खुद देने पड़ रहे हैं?
लेकिन बात यह है कि हाँ, लगता तो है कि भाई अपनी जेब से ही देने पड़ रहे हैं. इतनी मुसीबत के बाद भी टिकट हम ही दे रहे हैं. दिक्कत तो है. खैर,
आप क्या बोलेंगे इसमें? खुद दिए पैसे?
जी,
खुद दिए. मुश्किल हुई? बताइए उस मुश्किल के बारे में.
उस मुश्किल के बारे में हम क्या बोलेंगे? बस यही बोलेंगे कि हमारे हालात ख़राब थे, गरीब थे, इसलिए 2 महीने से काम नहीं चल रहा था, इसलिए मेरे पास कुछ जुगाड़ नहीं था, तो घर जाना ही था, तो इसीलिए घर जाने की तैयारी बनाई हमने.
And later on in that report, they basically we asked them कि आपने कैसे दिए, and this हमने phone बेचा, हमने कर्जा लिया, and so on. PKT Nambiar, it just reminds me, actually, this was, as Nikhil said, it held a mirror up to all of us, governments, politicians, us, the elite class, the upper middle class, the wealthy, all of us. In some ways, we have different levels of insensitivity and complicity here. Go ahead. You were wanting to make a point.
So it will be very unfair to even for any of us to say that, not to look at those visuals and give a comment and justify any of those stuff. I mean, that is going to be very, very bad. But what we are discussing today is that they were all visuals in multiple places. There are people who have supported somebody or the others. As you said, किसी का सेठ ने दिया होगा, किसी का employer ने, या somewhere or the other way, or somebody may have even sold their valuables and bought a ticket and went. It was that kind of a crisis. But the bottom line, what we are talking about is the Prime Minister's speech at the Parliament, wherein he was telling that at a time when that kind of a crisis hit, rather than supporting the government and standing together, there were a handful of opposition parties and leaders who took as a political opportunity for themselves to score a point, to undermine the position of the government and the prime minister, just to ensure that there is a kiosk is happened. And this is a truth which we all know, that in multiple media channels have showcased that particular time. So it is not about that. When the prime minister, as Nikhil ji said, that when prime minister himself has clearly announced that aap jahan pe hai wahi pe rukiyega. So of course there will be doubt.
I'll tell you, there's an important question raised by Nikhil, which I want both you and Mr. Bhandari to respond to, that he doesn't question the Prime Minister's intent. He believes that the Prime Minister acted from good faith. The government acted from good faith. It saw the world imposing lockdown, so it went and imposed the lockdown as well. And did not, as Anjali says, possibly anticipate this absolute abject crisis that then erupted. Then why question the intent, Nikhil asks, of the opposition? Ishkaran, do you want to take that? Why question the intent of the opposition? If you want that benefit of doubt, why not give it to your colleagues across the trenches as well, as the question from Nikhil?
Because I think if we are having a fair debate, nobody gives anybody the benefit of the doubt. The opposition does not give Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt in anything, nor does the BJP give the benefit of the doubt. That's just a factual statement. We can be holier than thou in a debate and say we should give benefit of doubt to the other side, but it's not happening on ground. And and it's not only an Indian phenomenon. We have become a very divided world, I think, in this age of social media. Nobody gets any benefit for anything nowadays. And we all know that. But then another point is, which is very important, is, was he trying to, that is my view, that he was trying to make a point that instead of being a constructive opposition, they were being an obstructionist opposition. And while we are now 2 years down the line saying, and why is it his intent important? While 2 years down the line, we can discuss, was this the best? Was that the best? Anybody sitting here can name one country in the world which did not make any mistake in how to handle COVID.
I agree.
Not
that
one
part,
country
yes.
With 10 times the resources of India. Let's be very real. Per capita income would be 20 times the per capita of India.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend of mine in Italy during the first wave. She had not had food for 3 days in Italy because that was a panic wave. Nobody was delivering anything. A person with resources could not get food for 3 days. So we were in that sort of a situation, and we are discussing it now after 2 years. And I think his point was they were being obstructionist. They were not trying to help. And second point, which we need to make it very clearly, is that it was not a fire or a tsunami. It was worse, because fire and tsunami is localized. It affects one area, one coast, one region. This was a pan-India epidemic. And were people trying to help in it? Or were people, because one example nobody can debate is that they were creating vaccine hesitancy. That is on record. So nobody can debate that. That was hurting the efforts of COVID. What other attempts made to hurt the effort of COVID is a political speech, and opposition will disagree, and BJP will say, yes, they were trying to hurt the efforts to destroy his image. But that is politics, and everybody's heart will go to all migrants. We are human. But the political part, we should not mix with that part. He is trying to blame for them for being obstructionists, and that is his view.
So let me take that to Sanjay. I think the argument I'm hearing from Ishkaran is that the politics is inevitable. If the opposition is going to say to the BJP and the Modi government, also in election season, that your mishandling of COVID is something we will make an electoral issue, then the BJP is inevitably also going to use electoral rhetoric to respond to it, as opposed to governmental sort of policy framework conversation. Sanjay, if you're going to play politics, you're going to get politics back, is what Ishkaran is saying.
Sure. But, the Prime Minister holds an august office. He was speaking in the sacrosanct chambers of India's parliament, and he lied. It's about time we stopped beating about the bush here. Narendra Modi lied on the floor of parliament. And COVID, look at the stuff he said on COVID, since we're discussing that. Narendra Modi wants the opposition to support him. When he was with Donald Trump, when the riots in Delhi were happening, he was not wearing a mask. Everybody, as Anjali rightly pointed out, was aware of the fact that COVID had come to India. I don't want to remind you, it'll upset the BJP bucks here, but Rahul Gandhi even tweeted on it. Obviously, Mr. Modi doesn't care a damn, right? Shall we also ignore the reality that when before the pre-COVID lockdown, the BJP was very busy playing communal politics on Corona jihad? And you expect the people of this country, secular, liberal, intelligent, and well-meaning people of this country to say, let's back this government which doesn't care a damn for you and me? And then you have the audacity of the Prime Minister. And you should read that, Barkha. And it's important to bring this up on today's show. Mr. Modi has claimed that the government of India did the best of any government in the country on handling COVID. This is what I call as a state of delusion. India today ranks third highest in the world with over 500,000 people who died on account of COVID. And I want to say this on your show, Barkha, with all the honesty that I can summon up, that the government of India actually let down its own people. The second COVID wave happened because Mr. Modi was busy celebrating the pharmacy of the world. His health minister was saying this is end game of the pandemic. Does this government have a moral fiber? I know.
Okay.
I won't wrap up. I won't take too long. Does this government have a moral fiber? I mean, look at the state of affairs here. That the Serum Institute of India provides 85% of the vaccines, and Mr. Modi is marketing himself on vaccine certificates. I think in India, the political bar is wretched, and opposition parties have messed up to an extent. I agree. But what is a prime minister for?
Okay, let Ishkaran respond to that. I do have to start taking closing comments, and Nikhil's barely got to speak. So Ishkaran and then Nikhil, and then we can close with Piketty and Anjali. Go ahead, Ishkaran. Yeah.
Barkha, one simple point which might upset dynasty bhakts here, but the reality is very, very clear. That when Trump came, was Trump wearing a mask? Forget India. Was US intelligence advising Trump to wear a mask or Trump not to come to India? That is something we have to deal with at the situation we were in. Secondly, no, I'm just saying so. Would US intelligence send Trump to a place where he can get an epidemic? They are very careful. You know how careful they are and how they decide how to come any place. Second point, which I would just like to make here is this, that we are again, when you do an attack on the prime minister politically and we are in an election season, everybody is doing a political attack. We are not having a data-based conversation. That is not possible in India. That is not possible even in our parliament. Unfortunately, we saw Rahul Gandhi attacking judiciary in a manner which is not fit for any leader of opposition to attack. And those words, if anybody else spoke, would be contempt of court. Nothing else, no defense. That would be clear contempt of court. But you could do that in a parliament. So when we are having one side doing that, the other, and I'm being very fair, both sides are doing it and they will do it. The other debate of how migrants are handled or not handled, that is a tragedy which the entire world faced, including India. And of course, enough errors were made, both by the central government as well as the state government.
Okay, Nikhil, can you tell us what's happening now? 2 years on, what is happening with these workers? I mean, if this is a conversation about workers, let's at least ask what's happening with these workers now. Some came back, some went to their villages and found there was nothing. Many of them were in debt. Some had sold land, some had sold, the only sort of piece of family gold they had, and so on. What's happening now?
Yeah, so Barkha, I want to first say one more thing about what we were discussing, which is that the Prime Minister, if we are saying this is what our politics is going to be, then there's something seriously wrong with politics, politicians, as well as analysts. Politics has to be about the people, and there were stranded workers at the core of this whole issue. What the Prime Minister said is not acceptable at all. It was abominable language. And what was worse was that he was making accusations vis-a-vis where someone was actually going out to help them. We also wanted to help workers get home. We also wanted to help them if they become and walking. Everyone should have had that duty. But let's leave that be. These people went home. Still today, lakhs of them, we know the unemployment, they have still not returned back. Many of them are still there. In that first year, 45% extra people came on Narega works. And what are we doing today? Our budgetary policies are to cut those. Our budgetary policies are not to give extra support. Our budgetary policies, and that's where my problem is, Barkha, we are not learning. Those were stranded and abandoned workers. And they are still stranded and abandoned workers. It's going to cost us. We only care about our stock market, but we are actually, one set of people are getting affluent, and that's what's been happening ever since. And we have seen nothing, absolutely nothing, that continued set of people on which policies at that time, they increased Narega spending, they did a little bit for food security, that saved lives, but that has also been cut. To come to a scenario and that will come home to hit our economy, to hit our society. And this show and these analysis should be mainly about what have we done to correct the injustice we did to those set of workers who we forced through orders. We forced through orders to sit there and who had no choice but food and hunger to make them work.
And I just want to underline, Nikhil, that those orders were actually fully unenforceable. When we asked workers to stay where they were absolutely unenforceable orders. One of the orders was that rent should be waived. It was not. The other order was wages should be given. Wages were not given. It was an immediate curtailment of all daily rights. Nikhil, sorry, you're trying to say something? Nikhil? Yeah, Nikhil? Nikhil, just remove your headphones and speak. Nikhil, just remove your headphones and speak. Can't hear you.
The Supreme Court, in fact, said that when people went to say we are not getting our wages and we are having to pay rent, the Supreme Court said you cannot coerce the employers into doing this. So the government had orders which were not enforceable. The people could not get them enforced. Where would they go except home to eat, to survive, or sit there and die?
I agree. And by the way, government policy eventually, PKD Nambiar, does reflect this. There are some false starts made to place people where they are, but eventually, as the Solicitor General is telling the Supreme Court that there are no migrants on the road, when there were migrants on the road the day he said this. I was there and I saw them, and I remember filing the report that day. The government eventually does exactly what it didn't want to happen, which is to send the workers home, which means that the government realized belatedly that it made a mistake.
Well, Barkha, there is a say that when a crisis hits, it's always considered as a dynamic situation. Nobody in this whole universe, even maybe the God can predict, or I don't know, but no government, or at least the government's names which we take, even like Sanjay ji loves to take, the US, UK, Canada, all these so-called big countries, the best of health facilities has failed miserably, even worse than India. So I think there are times we all need to understand the situation and respond. And as Prime Minister said, that what we are all looking at from a constructive opposition, rather than, so if you really look at the entire speech, because we are only talking about one portion of his speech, what he was talking about one by one, where all he has been opposed and taking the name of him in the early morning. They say subah uth ke muh dhote hi turant Modi ko gali de do, Modi gali de do, Modi chor hai. So from there, so the idea was not about the opposition's behavior in that particular time, was not about the corona crisis, rather than that making it as a anti-Modi.
Okay, about Modi. Got it.
About Modi and anti-Modi funda. That's it.
Okay, I've got 30 seconds, Anjali. Last word to you.
Barkha, the statement that came out of the Prime Minister, to me, was particularly alarming because it shows a mindset. We need, even today, we are not out of the pandemic. There is one wave after another, and which is being combated with lockdowns and the like. We would have hoped that yesterday the Prime Minister would have used that opportunity to show us a roadmap. What is going to happen now? Not do a political slugfest. We have a Supreme Court direction. We needed to approach the Supreme Court because, like you said, the orders that were brought out were totally unimplementable. The Supreme Court has given directions. The court has said that people don't have food to eat, migrants don't have food to eat. Make sure that you increase the net of the National Food Security Act. Give people ration cards. The numbers have not been increased since the 2011 census. The central government has done nothing, and they have actually replied under an RTI application saying that they are not planning to do anything about it. States were asked to put in place schemes to give people food and open community kitchens. The central government was told that if states ask you for the food grains, you have to give it. Under the RTI, the central government has told us that although some states did ask for food grains, they have not been given those food grains. What we had hoped was that the Prime Minister will stand there and say, look, the pandemic is not over. We recognize now. We are going to learn from our mistakes, and this is what we are going to do.
Okay,
I did see that, and that was alarming.
I have to leave it there. But I think the important point at the end is that we must turn our public attention, at least once these elections are over, and hopefully before them, to the people. The people at the heart of this issue are still on the margins of our attention, margins of our media attention, margins of our political attention, margins of our policymakers, and the noise, the surround sound, is what's distracting us. And I think, as Nikhil said, that's the real crime. Leaving it there, Nikhil, Sanjay, Anjali, Ishkaran, and I think Mr. Nambiar just left. Thank you, PKD, and to our audience. See you tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.